moved him.
Okay, thank you.
Good. All right.
I did too. Okay.
Please take your handout for the book Doesn't Hurt to Ask. Doesn't Hurt to Ask by Trey Gowdy. And we're going to begin with this presentation. The presentation on how to be an anti-racist will be the second presentation. Let's turn all the way to page 9 in the handout, Doesn't Hurt to Ask. Page 9 in the handout, Doesn't Hurt to Ask. The subtitle of this book is Using the Power of Questions to Communicate, Connect, and Persuade. This is a new book, and the book just hit the New York Times bestsellers list in September at the #3 spot, so it jumped up immediately as a business bestseller, although it's really a book about persuasion in every conceivable arena. If you look at the top of page 9 on the right, Trey Gowdy is a former prosecutor from South Carolina. They call them solicitors in South Carolina, but it's the job of a prosecutor. And then he was a member of Congress, a Republican from South Carolina, and he is best known for chairing the House Select Committee on Benghazi. If you are a loyal Republican, you will like reading this book leisurely. He slams a few Democrats in the process more than once, and he lets his politics come out clearly. But the book is not a political polemic, and he acknowledges that there were people on both sides that he interacted with, and he talks a great deal about what you have to do to be persuadable. And I like that phrase, to be persuadable. On the left side of page 9, I want to help you become a better advocate and become better at advancing what you believe through the art of asking the right questions at the right time, in the right order, and in the right form, regardless, in some instances, of whether you know the answer to your own questions or not. This is a book about asking questions as a tool to persuasion, to self-persuasion, and to the persuasion of others. We are going to explore in this book how to persuade, why it is the most worthwhile skill set to adopt, and all the tools you can equip yourself with to become persuasive on the issues that matter in your life and with the people who matter in your life. You lose your jury. Everybody take your pen and circle the phrase, you lose your jury. This is fun. You lose your jury when you make affirmative declarative statements if those statements are either wrong or unproven. And what he says is, in a courtroom, you are trying to persuade the jury. But in life, you are always trying to persuade the jury, whether that be yourself or your wife or your children or your boss or your colleagues or your customer. You are always in the business of persuading your jury. Between skill and authenticity, pick authenticity. Between technical superiority and likability, pick likability. Between debate and persuasion, pick persuasion. So, likability, authenticity, and persuasion. This is not a book about politics. I did not and do not want to write a book about politics. This is a book about effective communication and how to persuade or move others. The real significant change will occur when the listener makes up his or her own mind, drawing the final logical line himself or herself. So you're going to hear me say 2 or 3 times that this book makes the case that all persuasion is self-persuasion. You ask the questions, you raise the issues, and somebody has decided to follow along. All right, let me pause a minute. Jim Jameson, I've had somebody pop up who asked to meet, was in the waiting room. I didn't set up a waiting room, but we need to let them in. So I didn't even set up a waiting room.
Yeah, I turned on the waiting room.
We did that. Sorry.
Okay.
We did that because we've been hacked. So.
Oh, I got you. Thank you. Okay, good. All right.
Yeah, don't
I'm back
click on
to
the link.
handout.
It brings you to some Russian conversation.
And I'm hearing somebody there. Okay. This is a book filled with stories. If you read this book and you like comedians, he is an amateur comedian. He reminds me, I'm going to be candid, of my brother. My brother is funny like Trey Gowdy is funny. And he tells the story of the hunting trip and the hunting lodge. He's with a longtime friend. He's joining them for a weekend, and the man says, let's go hunting. And Trey Gowdy says, I don't hunt. He said, don't worry, I've got a hunting lodge. And they drive out in the middle of nowhere, and they stop. And then Trey Gowdy says to his friend, where's the hunting lodge? And the friend says, in the trunk of the car. And it was a tent. And so they spent 2 nights in a tent in the tent hunting lodge. And Trey Gowdy tells that with a little bit of he's a little offended at this, but having fun with it. So I just wanted to mention that. Now, a far more serious story. He tells a number of stories in the book about people that he prosecuted. And near the end of the book, he tells about a woman who had children, and they had escaped from, and there were court orders against, the husband who was violent. And he was the prosecutor, and he was building up to asking for the penalty phase. And so the woman and the children were being driven by a neighbor, and they noticed a car following them, and the car was the husband right on their tail. The woman quickly drove to the nearest police station. The woman herself, the driver, drove to the police station, the friend, and the woman was on the phone with the police saying, we're headed to the parking lot. They pull into the parking lot, police officers run out, but the man jumps out of the car and shoots the woman dead through the car in the police station parking lot. So that's a rather gripping story. And then he talks about what argument would you make to the jury. And by the way, he does not tell us what the jury decided on the penalty in the book. He tells a story about a conversation with a friend's mother that changed his own life. And this is here on page 9, it's in italics. My lack of a plan for the rest of my life was exceeded only by a lack of desire to have a plan for the rest of my life. She gently asked me question after question after question. So many questions. What she accomplished in those 30 minutes changed my life. He had arrived at the point where he needed to decide what to do with his education. He was with his friend. The mother pulled him aside. They sat and had a cup of coffee or a beverage, and she started asking him questions. And at the end of that, he had not had any idea exactly what he was going to do with his life. He decided to go to law school, and he built the career that he built. And he said, she never pointed me in that direction. She asked me questions about what I wanted to do, what I believed in, what I valued. That was very impressive. He says, he begins the book with this. He says, yes, there are some stupid questions. He talks about a witness at his very first trial. And he saw a gunman come into a store with a blue bag. And Trey Gowdy said to the witness, after he said that, and what color was the blue bag? And the guy said it was blue. And at this point, Trey Gowdy still hadn't taken the clue. And he said, what color was the black bag? And the judge says, we've established that it was a blue bag. It reminded me of a scene from My Cousin Vinny. So good story. Now, I'd like you to read this one carefully with me. The Black Driver and Law Enforcement. The persuasion, this is a quote from the book, started that afternoon with a mere question. How many times had I been stopped
No one
by
cares,
law
bro.
enforcement in the last year? Trey, I was stopped 7 times in 1 year as an elected official. 7. I want the officers to know I'm not a threat to them, so nothing bad happens to me. I want to be safe, Trey, and stay alive. Tim Scott, if you know the name Tim Scott, senator from a southern state, African American, right now serving in the Senate. Tim Scott is the one who had been stopped 7 times by law enforcement. Yes, because he was Black. And Tim Scott persuaded me to look at law enforcement through the eyes of others, not just the eyes of a white doctor's son who worked as a prosecutor and had only positive experiences with men and women in blue. He persuaded me to consider why communities of color are less likely to cooperate, less likely to give the benefit of the doubt to the police, and less likely to accept blindly law enforcement's view in officer-involved shootings. So here's a Republican senator, African American, who is saying, my experience with the police is different from yours, and that conversation started with the question, how many times have you been stopped by the police? Let's turn all the way back to page 2 for a few minutes. On the bottom of the book image, what is the point? People hold incomplete or incorrect or harmful or dangerous ideas and viewpoints. Learning how to persuade is how we help people move forward in their own lives and in our own. Learning to ask questions is a key element in our efforts to persuade. There are some questions that are not big questions. Do you prefer a Coca-Cola product or do you prefer a Dr. Pepper product? Doesn't matter. But wouldn't you acknowledge that there are some things that people believe that are wrong? I would acknowledge that. And if some people believe something that is wrong, then this next sentence is important. You might want to write this down. I believe this. I could be wrong. Not only could you be wrong, but I could be wrong. So this is a book about trying to make sure that you've done good thought, good thinking, arrived at good conclusions, and then you know your arguments well so you can try to persuade others. At the top of the page, 3 reasons why this book is worth our time. Number 1, this book is filled with stories from some very specific arenas of persuasion: the courts, the Congress, and life itself. Number 2, this book lays out the steps in the process of persuasion. It is a thorough tutorial. And number 3, this book reminds us that we need to engage in self-persuasion before we seek to persuade others. And there's something he says that is, I don't know if you would call this disturbing, but he said that he never saw a single member of Congress change their actual position and mind based on the persuasive arguments of somebody else in Congress. That's pretty amazing. Never saw it. Never saw it. Okay, we've got a number of the best of Randy's highlighted passages. These are all directly from the book. I'm going to just read a few of them. Turn to page 3, and we're going to move quickly. Be sure and put a star beside the ones that grab you. Number 9 on page, number 5 on page 3. The most effective persuaders listen as much as they talk. The most effective persuaders ask as many questions as they answer. Asking questions in the right way and at the right time may well prove to be the most effective tool you have. Number 9, I left the courtroom because the questions were better than the answers. I left Congress because the questions never matter in politics. Almost everyone in Washington, D.C. already has his or her mind made up. I do not recall a single person's mind ever being changed during a committee or floor debate during the 8 years I was in Congress. Number 12, what do you want to accomplish? And the first cousins to that question follow closely behind. What is your objective? How do you measure success at the end of the interaction? Who is your jury? How hard will it be to prove it? Rather than seeking to make a point, vote for my beliefs because they're right, or prove a proposition, you know, son, English majors are way more likely to be adaptable candidates in the job force. You have to move them gently to a specific objective in mind. While I may be a cynic, number 13, much of persuasion is about idealism. It's about open-minded people who can have meaningful dialogue about what it is they truly care about. Number 14, and that should be our objective in persuasion, striving to communicate and to move those with whom we are interacting, to move someone from a yes to a no, to move someone to a maybe. Write down in the margin here the word incremental. You want to move people incrementally. You can't move them all the way. So to move someone to a maybe, to move someone to see our side, to move someone to get a new angle and a new perspective, to move them to feel what you feel, to see what you see, to think what you think. Move them to do what's worthy, what's good, and what's right. Move them to hire you, to give you a chance, to give you more responsibility. Move someone to take a chance on your idea. Move someone to invest as much in what you are trying to do as you have invested. All right, I'm going to just read a couple of more of these. Turn to page 4. Look at number 24. No, number 18. The minute you make a false declarative statement, when you say something false, you lose credibility with the person with whom you are talking or whoever might be listening. If you do not tell the truth as you understand it, you do not, if you tell something that is false, you lose your credibility. That's Ethos 101 from Aristotle. Number 24, I want you to ask yourself a question in the privacy of your own conscience and answer it truthfully. Are you genuinely open to moving on a position of altering the way you look at an issue or considering a different vantage point? If you are not open to doing that, what makes you think that others will be? So are you persuadable yourself? That's the key. Number 28, persuasion is not coercion. You must help the person. You drive the person with your statements, questions, demeanor, authenticity, and experience to reach the conclusion on his or her own. Turn to page 5, number 42. Put a box around 42 and a star beside it. First, I ask myself, what do I know? Then, how do I know it? Is the source reliable? And last, what are the limits of my knowledge? What do I not know? So what do I know? Where did I get what I know? Are they accurate? And what are the limits to what I know? What do I not know? So that's really, I think, a profound thing. Look at number 47. Learn how people think. learn what motivates them, learn what moves them, inspires them, scares them, learn where they are and how they got there. What do they want? What do they crave? In other words, you are trying to persuade people, not robots. All right. Number 55 on page 6, number 55. There is a reason I begin many sentences with, are you open to blank? No one considers herself or himself to be closed, so of course they want to be open. The burden of persuasion is to get me to consider something or be open to something is much lower than getting me to accept or participate in something. So ask, are you open to? All right, page 7, number 75, how you do things matters every bit as much as the result you achieve. The end does not justify the means. And then page 8, number 90. I love number 90. When you are talking to a large group, remember that they are not listening as a large group, but fundamentally, people hear on an individual level. You're speaking to an individual, not to a group. Even if there's a large number, you're speaking to one person at a time. And then number 93, just because I thought it was pretty insightful, politics is a lagging indicator. So that was interesting. All right, turn back to page 9, and I'm going to move quickly here. Bottom of the page, the last 2 bullet points. We are all in the persuasion business. Whether we are talking about job or family or court or Congress or politics, we are all in the persuasion business. What is persuasion? It's not about winning arguments. Persuasion is about effectively and efficiently advocating for what it is you believe to be true. Persuasion is about understanding what people believe and why they believe it, and using that to either debunk or confirm their position. Persuasion is subtle, circle that word subtle, incremental, circle that word incremental, and deliberate. You're trying to persuade. It has the potential to be life-changing. Turn to page 10. Getting someone to do something they were not planning on doing, that's persuasion. Convincing someone to buy into something they never knew they were looking for, that's persuasion. The old way of persuasion is declarative statements. When it comes to the art of persuasion, we've typically been led to think of the following format: opening statement, make a point, state an argument, a long stream of declarations, affirmations, etc. So slowly build an argument with as few holes as possible and as many powerful assertions as one can fit in a breath. That's the traditional model, but what if there is a better way? Persuasion, the new way, is you ask questions. Questions gather the time, the information. Gowdy's main point, all persuasion is self-persuasion. By asking questions, you help a jury arrive at the conclusion the persuader believes is correct. Therefore, all questions were so that they could arrive at the truth of their own accord. And so the persuader and his or her jury, every persuader has to identify and then seek to persuade the jury. The jury has to be open-minded. The most persuasive are the persuadable. I have to be open-minded and persuadable in order to persuade others. Persuasion is incremental, step by step. It's not about winning people over. It's about bringing people closer together in their views. Think of persuasion as change, as movement, as incremental. Here are the steps of persuasion. Identify your objective, your purpose, your end goal. I want this to happen. Know or gather all the relevant facts that undergird your position. Spend some time considering the other side of the issue. Consider the other side of the issue. Have a clear sense of whom, of which group you are trying to persuade. And now the calibration, the burden of proof, how much persuasion is enough to move the person to the point you are trying to make. Burden of proof. Here's some practical disciplines. Practice. He says, my best closing arguments were arrived at while mowing the lawn. Put your argument in the best possible order. You don't put your important stuff in the middle. You either start with it or he likes to end with it. No, he likes to start with it. Others say end with it. Develop greater empathy. Empathy is critical and powerful. It connects us. So work on your empathy. Cultivate sincerity. Be engaged. Get eye contact as much as you can. Be likable and never lie. The number one credibility killer is lying. It's not simply making a false statement. It's making an intentionally false statement that is material to a point, to a question, with the intent to deceive. People can, will, and do forgive almost anything, but they are loath to forgive an effort to intentionally mislead them on an important and material point. And then learn to use repetition effectively. Redundancy and repetition. This is important, so I'm going to say it to you over and over and over again. Here are my 6 lessons and takeaways. You could be wrong about some things, even some very important things, and so could I. You will not change for the better, number 2, if you are not open-minded. Number 3, you will not change for the better if you're not listening to people who can help you make such moves toward change. Number 4, you will not help others change for the better if you do not help them arrive at their own reasons to shift and move and change. Help them arrive at self-persuasion. Number 5, questions really matter. Ask lots of questions, beginning with questioning yourself. And number 6, in all matters, tell the truth. Never lie. This is foundational. Well, that's the book. Doesn't hurt to ask, using the power of questions to communicate, connect, and persuade. I'm going to pause for 60 seconds and begin the second presentation. Drop in a thought in the chat on something you might have learned from this one. I'll be back in 60 seconds.
Randy, we're having to leave several people in the waiting room where we can't verify that they're legitimate. So you may get some complaints that some people were not admitted.
Okay. Thanks, Jim. And I'm sorry we had that happen. This was new to me. So
Taylor's doing the heavy lifting. She's good at this.
okay. Okay, I'm coming back on. Somebody wave and tell me you can still hear me. Michael Egan, can you hear me? Good. All right, so everybody can hear me. This next presentation is how to be an anti-racist. I have a slide that I wanted to show at the beginning of this presentation. And I'm going to read it to you. And so listen carefully, please. Before we begin, you deserve to know my stance. And so I have 4 things I want to say kind of about the racism issue and our current situation in our country. I believe that the vast majority of law enforcement officers are not racist, and they are well-meaning. But I also believe that too many law enforcement officers have been silent in the face of racism and abuse. So most are not racist and well-meaning, but some racist law enforcement officers have allowed their racism to lead them to do bad things. We call these bad apples. And other law enforcement officers have been silent. I'm going to say one more word about that in just a moment. Next, I believe that the shadow of white supremacy, that was the official position of the Confederate States of America, and it was the legal stance, we forget this, of the entire US government for decades after the Civil War. If you don't know about the Jim Crow laws and legal segregation, those were elements of white supremacy. And the shadow of that still lingers in our country. And last, I believe in the right to peaceful protest, but I do not approve of violence in any way. I condemn it. I am an appreciative student of the philosophy of nonviolence taught by and practiced by Martin Luther King Jr., but I deplore and condemn any violence. So I wanted to say that I kind of come from that starting point. And then I want to go back to the law enforcement question, because when we say, is there systemic racism? Is there still racism? Does it still exist in our country? All you have to do is look at the news yesterday in Fort Worth, Texas, where the white mayor had to condemn the racist actions of an active Fort Worth police officer. And the police officer was, in essence, fired for something that police officer put up on social media. Now, that person was a bad apple, but no one yet has done the tallying of other police officers who liked the social media post and who, in essence, agreed with the racism of the police officer. That's what I mean when I say there are some police officers who are silent, and if they were to all speak out against racism, it would be better. So those are kind of some initial thoughts before we get to the handout of this remarkable book, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. For those of you who might be on this for the first time, we've always done 2 business books a month. I'm doing 4 books on racial justice, and this is the 4th one. I have presented Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi and White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo and The Color of Law by Rothstein, and now the 2nd and later book by Ibram X. Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist. I think I'm just going to kind of walk through the handout. So turn to page 2. We're going to do this as quickly as we can. Underneath the book image, what is the point? In addition to the actual harm of overt racism, the ongoing danger comes from non-racists who, by their silence and lack of activism, help perpetuate a racist society. And so you've got racists, they're harmful, but non-racist, people who say, I'm not an anti-racist, but I'm not a racist, their silence leads to more problems. On the top right, why is this book worth our time? This book is another candid, heart-wrenching look at the overt racism in our past as a country, including the racism of our elected, influential office officials and leaders. Number two, this book is a painful reminder that policies are enacted and protected that perpetuate the racism in our society. And the word policy is really critical in this book. He believes that policies matter. And number three, this book is a clear call to be an anti-racist. It provides strategies and a touch of motivation to keep fighting the anti-racist battle. All right. As always, I won't be able to read all of these highlights. I encourage you to read them on your own, but we're going to walk through and read a few of them. On page 2, number 5, denial is the heartbeat of racism, beating across ideologies and races and nations. Turn to page 3, number 8. I've come to see that the movement from racist to anti-racist is always ongoing. It requires understanding and snubbing racism based on biology or ethnicity or body or culture or behavior or color or space and class. Let me pause. If you go back and read what was said by leaders of our country and by academicians, they said that Black people are not as capable of learning as white people. In the same way that they said, well before 1920 and later, that women are not as capable of understanding big issues as men. The fact is that there is no biological argument that argues that white people are better than Black people. And yet there are lots of things written that argued that. Now, he himself in this book admits that he bought into some of the arguments that were racist against Black people. And so he says, Black people can be racist. He doesn't mean against white people, because white people are in kind of different positions, but against other Black people. My parallel to draw is Jewish people who were complicit with Nazis during the days of the death camps. So he wouldn't, I'm not implying his was that bad, but he talks about his own racist thoughts. All right, look at number 14, and please read on your own all of the ones in bold and big font, but stay with me as I go through. Racist policies have been described by other terms: institutional racism, structural racism, systemic racism. Racist policy is more tangible and exacting, and more likely to be immediately understood by people, including its victims, who may not have the benefit of extensive fluency in racial terms. Institutional racism, structural racism, systemic racism are redundant. Racism is institutional, structural, and systemic. Focusing on racial discrimination takes our eyes off the central agents of racism, racist policy, and racist policy makers, or what I call racist power. Number 18. So what is a racist idea? A racist idea is any idea that suggests one racial group is inferior or superior to another racial group in any way. An anti-racist idea is any idea that suggests the racial groups are equals in all their apparent differences, that there is nothing right or wrong with any racial group. Anti-racist ideas argue that racist policies are the cause of racial inequities. Now, last month, I talked about the Shingle Mountain in Dallas. On this morning's Dallas Morning News, back page, I think, of the front section, there is an article about more toxic breathing and debris affecting an African American community in the Dallas area. These are racist policies that allow that. All right, turn to page 4, number 21. White people are more likely than Black and Latinx people to sell drugs. And the races consume drugs at similar rates. Yet African Americans are more likely than whites to be jailed for drug offenses. Non-violent Black drug offenders remain in prisons at about the same length of time as violent white criminals. He calls this racist policy. All right, number 27, we are what we see ourselves as, whether what we see exists or not. We are what people see us as, whether what they see exists or not. And he talks a great deal about W.E.B. Du Bois, who talks in The Soul of Black Folk about how every Black person has to define himself as American and Black, whereas white people do not have that dual reality. All right? Turn to page 5, number 44. Unarmed Black bodies, which apparently look armed to fearful officers, are about twice as likely to be killed as unarmed white bodies. Put a star beside that. That's part of what has created much of the great unrest. All right, turn to page 6. When the reaction to the Nazi Holocaust marginalized biological racism, we can't believe in biological racism, the white supremacy of the master race, cultural racism stepped into its place. And so Black people were raised thinking this way. Look at number 66. This is a little ditty that Black people kind of repeated. If you're white, you're right. If you're yellow, you're mellow. If you're brown, stick around. If you're Black, get back. So that's the idea. I want to find one more specific quote, so give me just a moment. Here it is. Turn to page 9. This is really something. Number 103. For U.S. segregationists like United States Senator Ben Pitchfork Tillman, President Theodore Roosevelt crossed the color line when he dined with Booker T. Washington on October 16, 1901. So President Roosevelt dined with a Black man in 1901. Quote from Tillman: "The action of President Roosevelt in entertaining that blank will necessitate our killing 1,000 blank in the South before they will learn their place again." He was not joking. I'm reading the new book by Isabel Wilkerson called Caste. It's a masterpiece. I read her earlier book, The Warmth of Other Suns, which won the Pulitzer Prize. In Caste, she tells this story. In the early 1960s, in Birmingham, Alabama, there was an election for mayor. And there was a chief law enforcement officer in Birmingham named Bull Connor. If you know your civil rights history, that's a big name. And Bull Connor had a preference for a candidate. 2 white men running for mayor, but he had a preference. So he arranged for a Black man to walk up to the other candidate and just meet him and shake his hand. And that happened out in public in Birmingham in the early 60s. And he had a photographer ready. And when the black man was shaking the white mayor candidate's hand, a picture was snapped. It was put on the front page of the Birmingham newspaper. And it said, mayoral candidate greets Negro. And to put it mildly, that candidate never stood a chance. That's in my lifetime and your lifetime, for many of you. That's pretty astonishing. And that's anti-racism trying to make sense of the incredible racism. Bull Connor was the active racist. The people who went along were the non-racists, but they were plenty racist. All right, turn to page 11, moving very quickly. On the left, what's the problem with being not racist? It's a claim that signifies neutrality. I'm not a racist, but neither am I aggressively against racism. But there is no neutrality in the racism struggle. The opposite of racist isn't not racist, it is anti-racist. What's the difference? One endorses either the idea of a racial hierarchy as a racist or racial equality as an anti-racist. One either believes problems are rooted in groups of people as a racist or locates the roots of problems in power and policies as an anti-racist. There is no in-between safe space of not racist. It's a mask for racism. This book is ultimately about the basic struggle we're in to be fully human and to see that others are fully human. At the bottom, I became a college professor to educate away racist ideas, seeing ignorance as the source of racist ideas, seeing racist ideas as the source of racist policies, seeing mental change as the principal solution, seeing myself, an educator, as the primary solver. My research kept pointing me to the same answer. The source of racist ideas was not ignorance and hate, but self-interest. On the right, Ibram X. Kendi, this book is a memoir of his life along with policy and history. He is the Andrew Mellon Professor in the Humanities at Boston University and the founding director of the Boston University for Anti-Racist Research. I've seen him on the news in the last week. I try to let the books speak. That comes out of my time as an expository preacher. And one of the things he said in this book, I'm reading here from this page, is if only I'd spent more time listening to Martin Luther King instead of all the adults who claim to speak for him. I'm a fan of reading the speeches and writings of Dr. King. And when you hear somebody say, you know, after a racist event or word or phrase, that's not who I am. Yeah, it is who they are. It comes out of who they are. And so prelude number 2, what shall we do with all these different people around us who look different, their skin color is different, their backgrounds are different? Shall we treat them as equal and full participants in our society? And I believe the only answer is yes. Some stories. Thomas Jefferson, as Thomas Jefferson suspected a decade after declaring white American independence, quote, the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments both of body and mind. So Thomas Jefferson, 3rd president, wrote our Declaration of Independence, was a white supremacist. Those are his words. And David Hume, the Enlightenment philosopher, said, I am apt to suspect the Negroes and in general all the other species of men to be naturally inferior to whites, white supremacy. America was founded by white men for white men. Senator Jefferson Davis said on the floor of the Senate in 1860 before he became the president of the Confederacy. There's a remarkable story in this book. I'm on page 12. Kendi's parents were at Urbana 1970, Urbana, Illinois. It was the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship gathering. I was a college student. I was reading InterVarsity Christian Press books at that time and wanted to go to that gathering, but couldn't, from Abilene. And on the last day, Tom Skinner, a black preacher, quoting from the 4th chapter of Luke, quoting from what Christians call one of the Old Testament prophets, said, quote, "The liberator has come." His parents, Kendi's parents, were both at that conference, but had not yet met. They later met, married, and had Abram as a child. And he says that, let me read it here. At Urbana 70, Ma and Dad found themselves leaving the civilizing and conserving and racist church they realized they'd been a part of. They were saved into black liberation theology and joined the churchless church of the Black Power movement. They stopped thinking about saving black people and started thinking about liberating black people. And what he says is, I became a secular follower, not a Christian follower, but a secular follower of the ideas of the liberator has come. So I'm reading down the options. You can be a racist, you can be an anti-racist, but you can only claim to be a non-racist. A non-racist is silent at racism. A key point: definitions matter. Definitions anchor us in principles. Racism is a marriage of racist policies and racist ideas that produces and normalizes racial inequities. So the duality Du Bois talked about, to be American is to be white is to not be a Negro. That's Du Bois back over 100 years ago. So there are white people who are racist against black people. There are black people racist against other black people, when they, in essence, demand that he puts it this way. He says, if I make a mistake, it's tempting for some to say, that's what black people do. But he said, if a white person makes a mistake, they don't say that's what white people do. That's the difference, and it's a big difference. So he says there are two kinds of racism in Birmingham. Those who planted the church bombs, those are the overt racists, but also those who set the policies that made it that 500 black babies die each year, and that's far higher than white babies. So racism has its tentacles everywhere. Put a box around the bottom item. The centrality of the notion of hierarchy, my group is above your group. From the beginning, to make races was to make racial hierarchy. And so white people believe they are above black people. Whether you do, that's been the history of our country. Whoever makes the cultural standard makes the cultural hierarchy. The act of making a cultural standard and hierarchy is what creates cultural racism. Turn to page 13. The strategy of an anti-racist revolves around policy change. The call is to be an activist, Changing minds is not a movement. Critiquing racism is not activism. Changing minds is not activism. An activist produces power and policy change, not mental change. We use the terms demonstration and protest interchangeably at our own peril, like we interchangeably use the terms mobilizing and organizing. A protest is organizing people for a prolonged campaign that forces racist power to change a policy. A demonstration is mobilizing people momentarily to publicize a problem. So what do you do? And what I want you to do is put a box around this and read it very carefully. We're over time, but I need about 2 more minutes. Admit racial inequity is a problem of bad policy, not bad people. Identify racial inequity in all its intersections and manifestations. Investigate and uncover the racist policies causing racial inequity. Invent or find anti-racist policy that can eliminate racial inequity. Well, let me encourage you to read the rest of this paragraph, but it's basically a call to pursue policy change. At the bottom of the page, my 5 lessons and takeaways. Number 1, I encourage you, Randy Mayeux encourages you to quit pretending that racism is not still a problem. It is. In Dallas, in Fort Worth, in our country, in our world. Quick pause. A woman, black barrister in England, I think it was England, it was in the United Kingdom, last week was stopped 3 times entering a courtroom on the day when she was not supposed to be wearing a wig that would identify her as a barrister. She was stopped 3 times by 3 different officials saying, "You don't belong here," because she was a black woman and they assumed she was a defendant. Racism is still a problem. Number 2, maybe do some serious study. What you don't know is probably worth learning and worth knowing. I did not know all of the quotes from Thomas Jefferson and from David Hume and from Pitchfork Ben Tillman. Number 3, maybe do some serious self-examination. How have you contributed to the racism in our society? Number 4, learn to separate your preference from what is right and wrong and just get rid of that preference. In other words, look at behavior and look at systemic problems that might lead to behaviors. And number 5, maybe it is time to blank, and I left it blank for you to fill out. How to be an anti-racist, Ibram X. Kendi. I hope you found this useful. I'm pausing for a second and then I'll wrap up. All right, let me address everybody for a minute. This is the first time that we have had somebody bomb our Zoom meeting. I don't know what all has happened. I saw it happening on the slides. And I don't know how, I want to make this available to everybody, and I don't know how we can apologize for people that couldn't get in. But what does it say in our culture that can happen? I'm going to